we're going to be talking about poverty. And we have our two panelists here, Mathias, Risse, and Monique Deveaux. Mathias is a professor of philosophy and public policy at Harvard. His primary research areas of interest are contemporary political philosophy and also decision theory. He has two kind of connected books, one a bit more specific, one a bit more abstract, that interact with each other. Global Political Philosophy is one of them, and On Global Justice, the other. Monique is a professor of philosophy at the University of Guelph. She works in the intersection of normative ethics and social and political philosophy. She has a new book coming out, fantastic title, you ready? Here it is. Global Justice from Below, The Ethics and Politics of Poor-Centered Poverty Reduction. Same format as last time. Mathias is going to go first, then Monique, then...
All right, there we go. So it's getting a little bit boring here, but there it is. So, why bother domestic inequality and global inequality? That is my topic for today. So let me jump right in. The topic of justice has come up in the previous session already, so I know this is a good connecting point to what I'm doing because I want to think about these different types of inequality, domestic and global, from a standpoint of justice, how to think about that from a standpoint of justice. So just very quickly, so as we're thinking about justice, it's actually it's a remarkable fact about the current situation in political philosophy that there's a fair number of proposals of what justice amounts to. So as in here, there's the following set of principles and the following distinctions, but there is relatively little reflection on what justice, what the concept of justice is actually about. What are we talking about when we're talking about justice? My working understanding of what we're talking about when we're talking about justice is we are thinking about how to give people, or what it means for people to have an appropriate share in what our distinctively human capacities for cooperation allow us to build and maintain and construct. And so that's I think the core meaning. One can explain a lot of what goes under the name of justice really also in a cross-cultural context. In the Western context, the points of orientation, so as in where do we ground the conversation, normally goes back to Plato and Aristotle. So Plato gives us this the classic understanding of justice as each having or doing his or her own. That may sound like a bit of a trivial idea, but of course it's a major advancement in thinking and a very important idea that there is such a thing, right? Some things being one's own, having one's own, doing one's own. That's the original idea of justice there. And then, more importantly, for my purposes right now, Aristotle's understanding Aristotle then a generation later introduces an important distinction into this domain and says, well, now we have this understanding of what justice is. I want to distinguish between rectificatory justice and distributive justice. So the notion of distributive justice, or in English now is distributive justice we get from Aristotle, and the idea there was distributive justice is concerned with what the polis owns together, what the polis holds together, so the city-state holds together. It is important, it's actually that might be a potential point of disagreement with Monique later as we just chatted in the break. So it's important as you think about distributive justice that what the polis owns or holds together, even in the Aristotelian notion, is not limited to stuff, right? This is not about money or objects. This is also one example that Aristotle mentioned explicitly there is honors, right? So among the things that we hold together are honors, so what we grant to each other in terms of honors is covered here. So these are the points of orientation, and then so fast forward, so there's a lot of stuff that happens in between that one can develop as part of an overall, I think, ongoing conversation about how to make sure, or how to think about what it is for people to have an appropriate share of what our human capacities enable us to do. So fast forward, at the end of the 18th century, so Enlightenment time, industrialization time, French Revolution, scientific revolution, all these major breakthroughs in human activity and thinking, we're getting a recognizable notion of social justice. And so the formulation social justice as such only comes into circulation in the early 19th century, but there's a recognizable notion of social justice present, for example, in Immanuel Kant as a thought construct. And so what is social justice? Well, the idea here is, so remember in Aristotle it was what the polis holds together. So by now, this is a much more, we're living in a very different political world, and so kind of complex society that the Enlightenment era with these various revolutions makes possible in the first place. So in a way, what these common holdings are, what we do and are together is much more complex now. And what's built into this understanding of social justice at this stage are also these ideas here. So we have now firmly grounded there the idea that each person matters in this discussion, right? So each person matters in such a way that this person's material well-being, so kind of a basic status, is recognized. This has not been trivially included in the Western understanding of distributive justice we entered at some point. It's also included at the stage that giving people their appropriate share is something that is practically possible, but it's not a pipe dream, it's something that is part of human social engineering, that it is for the state to do, that the state should see itself this way, right? The state is not a predatory entity or something otherwise not concerned with material well-being and making sure people get appropriate shares. And it is also, then finally, was also built into the notion at this stage that there needs to be some kind of secular justification. We need to be able to explain to each other what we do. And this, of course, is also, so we're getting a notion like this around 1800, and then as the 19th century progresses, we also, of course, and this is actually connecting back to it, I'm going to connect back to various points to what Jacob said earlier, actually. So what we're finding in the 19th century, then, of course, is a massive increase in state capacities. Right? So what we now think of as the state really wasn't in existence at all until it gradually got to be so in the 19th century. And so one wonderful thing to read there is by actually Jacob's colleague, Scott seeing like the state, right? So the kind of streamlining and data collection, development of techniques, and everybody has the first name and last name, they speak the same language and all that. So that's all 19th century phenomenon. So the state also has, so in a way the state is much more appropriately now regarded as a location for a notion of social justice, right? So these things develop together. So fast forward again, so then we are encountering these massive phenomena of inequality in the last 40 years since the 1970s, and so this is you have seen data like this, right? So in the 1970s, the top 1% accounts for about 10% of national income. Today it's 20%, and the top 1% accounts for 8% of everything. So, or put differently, it's not a different way of thinking about this. If you think about growth, right, economic growth over the last 30, 40 years, half of what we are now doing better, faster, more compared to what we did 30 or 40 years ago is equivalent to the top 0.1%. Right? So actually quite dramatic. It is not an American phenomenon. It's really the domestic inequality is happening in other countries just as well. So this is actually a very illuminating slide for such purposes. So what we see here on the horizontal axis is country ventiles, so 5% groupings, right? And how the y-axis tells you how they are respectively doing in the global scheme of things. So the top 5% in the United States, all the way up in the global scheme of things. The bottom 5% in the United States are still doing fairly well. They're around 70th percentile in the global scale. Not every, of course, this is 5%. This is quite a lot of people, and this is a lot of people are not going to be up there, but the average person is there. But what's striking about this is that you see, if you look at Brazil, China, and India, so there you have the lower segments of society like really way low, right? So they're really slotting in very badly on a global scale. But the upper ventile there, the upper ventile is actually pretty much getting competitive with what's happening in the United States. So the phenomena of inequality really are quite stunning, and there has been a fair amount of reflection, and some of that was mentioned by Jacob. Why has this been happening? Right? And some of what's being said there is actually quite dramatic. So Piketty's thesis if true, is actually really is really not boding well for us in the future. So Piketty's point is this is happening because it's inherent in the development of capitalism. That the people who own the means of production get more out of a functioning economy than the people who just work there. Right? So the returns on capital are higher than the growth of the economy as such. We have not noticed that, and in a way this is also one of these major messages coming out of Piketty's work. We have not noticed these inherent workings of capitalism in the 1 century where capitalism really was kind of had its full run, right, for a whole century in many, many countries in the world, maybe the 20th century, because the 20th century also was one characterized by major calamities, in particular the world was the Great Depression. Right? And these are political, both economic and political events that are distorting that picture, and are, for one thing, deleting a lot about, erasing a lot about, and also allow for inequality diminishing policies. Right? And so since that's been the case, we have actually not noticed that capitalism as such works like this, and so the key remedy for this is then to say there has to be massive distributed efforts coordinated around the world. Right? So that's one thesis, and that is quite dramatic because it predicts that there's going to be an enormous amount of ossification in society, right? As inequality gets vested across generations. There's economists, actually, many economists favor a different view, maybe at a deeper level, not terribly inconsistent, but the cat's golden view on this is, so they're saying what's been happening. So the people who are wealthy these days, these are the ones who actually, these are the ones who are either capable of producing or otherwise using technology to their advantage. Right? So the great performance of the United States in the schooling area that Jacob mentioned, until about 50, 60 years ago or so, meant that people would go to school, and then having the schooling, they would be ready to move to the more successful circuits in the economy, and that has been no longer the case, right? So the schooling as such doesn't actually get ready, doesn't get people ready to be leaders in the economy. So you need to have a special kind of schooling. You need to go to good schools, like the average school no longer does that. Nowadays it's those who are actually coming out in the world with the capacity of commanding technology. You see this everywhere, right? So this is the manager who now has much more penetration of the company. It's the finance guy who comes up with a great idea that then spreads everywhere. Or it's Michael Sandel teaching a justice course that you can see all around the world, right? So also in every neck of the woods, kind of not knowing what to do with technology puts you forward. So there's different ways of thinking about why that's been happening. So the reason why I'm saying these are not necessarily consistent theories is because it might be true that Katz and Godin are explaining a mechanism at this stage in history that Piketty says is kind of bound to happen one way or another. Right? So that's how they might be consistent. But my main concern is actually not so much why this is happening, but why it would be problematic. And it would be problematic at the domestic level because, well, if you start thinking about what a society is, right? What is a country? What is happening with shared citizenship? What are we doing? What do we have in common as American passport holders? Well, we are engaged in a very complicated social structure, of which these following three things are true. For one thing, it's a conventional arrangement. We have arranged it a certain way, and it could be arranged differently. Right? We could have a different socioeconomic system, just like other countries have very different ways of organizing their socioeconomic lives. It's an intensely cooperative arrangement, right? We do things together, we have the same, we're sharing infrastructure, we're sharing an insurance system, we're sharing a schooling system, and so we really depend on each other in a cooperative network. And it's a highly coercive operation, so if you think about the logically possible things that you could do any given day, right? So most of them will become illegal at some point as you're talking that logical force, right? So enforcement in states is strongly present, it's immediate, they seize your assets, they seize your body, so coerciveness is very strongly present, at least in countries with state capacities. So all of that is important to keep in mind for the next slide now. So why is it problematic that there is such massive inequality? Well, if you think about what we're doing when we're engaging in conversation about who should have what, or what are appropriate shares and what we do together, often people would then say, well, I've done this and I've done that, so I deserve this, I've earned this, right? So my deserved claims are of the following sort, and they refer to facts about their personal history. And one thing always to say back to them is then to say, well, it might be true that that you should have a great job because you did get a great education and you put in a lot of effort. But there's this other question that you also need to think about, namely, what kind of system do we have? Do we want to have within which then certain trajectories are rewarded more than others? Right? So what kind of system do we have, and that you are deserving of certain rewards in the system that we do have doesn't mean that you are entitled to having that kind of system. right? So when you are getting too enamored of your accomplishments professionally or in schooling, and you think society should work a certain way for you, you must not forget this other question that's much more interesting for philosophers, namely, what kind of system should we have in the first place? And that's where Advanced actually, that society looks like it has these features, like conventional, cooperative, coercive. And then we also have to understand now that given the social science understanding that we have to design policies, actually a lot of creativity could go into thinking about how we want to live together. So what's definitely fair to say then, if you think about the conventional, cooperative, coercive, one thing that is easily ruled out as justifiable, but that's clearly not justifiable, is that life chances within such a structure are very much fixed by facts about your work, right? So this is not an argument for anything. Again, this doesn't take us all the way to equality or anything like that, but in a way it operates in conversations in a kind of dialectic way by saying, if somebody says, no problem about inequalities, I've observed and I've learned this, and you say, look, this is what society looks like, and this is pushing back against too much inequality, and you also remind them of the fact that only because, again, they have earned it in the society, they're not entitled to having a society that deserves them for something like this. And of course, as we come back to this key theme of ossification, right? So a lot of positional goods in society. Only so many students can go to the top universities. Only so many people can work for the top banks and so on, right? So positional goods, and they are getting started with people with these privileged lifestyles, and so this is why this is problematic at the domestic level. Inequality is problematic at the domestic level, and there's a lot of policy options that we have that we understand well enough as to how this can be influenced. A lot of interesting stuff has been written articulating frustration, alienation of people in society, Ta-Nehisi Coates between the world and me, growing up African American in this case in the city of Baltimore. But then, of course, we have these interesting phenomena in recent times that it's that white people fall behind in health data, as we heard this morning, but that they also very strongly feel that this country is no longer for them. So Spain is in their own land. It's about the white working class, and Hillbilly Elegy by Lady Nance is about the collapse of the white working class in the Appalachian region. So these are I think these one can read these as books that are saying this here doesn't work for us, right? So we are supposed to comply with this society. We don't want the system that works like this. We want a different system where people like us are doing better, and they can make a case again based on saying, we are expected to play by the rules. It's coercive, it's intensely cooperative, and we could do it in any number of different ways. Yeah. So how does it relate to the global context? Well, first of all, general fact, if you look around, globalization, what is globalization doing in the world? Well, one thing to notice is that globalization at the aggregate level generally works quite well for countries. So overall, countries are benefiting. Right? That's the old competitive advantage logic of the free trade argument, which does very important work at the aggregate level. But as you also know, when you listen to economists or non-economists, right? So what economists like to emphasize, what we can do then, it's a central feature in many of these debates, is in principle we could then redistribute, right? So the country as a whole benefits, and since the country as a whole benefits, it's up for political processes to redistribute. It's known as calorie sufficiency, right? So in principle we could redistribute. But of course, the actual reality of redistribution is enormously different, right? So the politics of redistribution are enormously difficult. So redistribution, I put this in quotation marks because there's a lot presupposed once you say redistribute, because it sounds like people have established entitlements already. From a philosophical point of view, of course, they don't have this, but what practically has to happen politically is that you do take things away from people who already have them, and that is politically very hard to do, right? So this is one complication we have there. One other thing that's happening as we are looking at the global level is people feel threatened, right? People feel comfortable in their local context. They have a sense of control and comfort. Often, not everybody, but a lot of people have that. And they perceive normative threats through the onslaught of globalization. Like the world is too big, the world is too anonymous, there's too much happening. Maybe strangers are coming into the community that weren't there before. Often this is actually not very properly analyzed in terms of an economic threat or a security threat. That's really not at the end of the day what's bothering people. What is bothering people is more like a normative threat. right? There's a threat to your standing, right? To the recognition of your community. So that's what's meant by normative threat, and this is why people are getting protective of their country or their nature. And of course, somebody who's now living in the White House, actually mostly living in Florida, he took massive advantage of that, right, by rubbing on this point. Now, one response to this, of course, is exactly what he did, by making the problem massively worse in the long run, right? So basically saying, okay, the American working class is suffering. What are we going to do? We're not going to think, strategically about what it takes to adjust to a new technological landscape where many fewer people will have to be in the workforce in the future. What can they do differently in the Midwest to kind of adjust to the times? No, we're thinking about building a wall and buying American and hiring American, which is politically a lot easier, of course, than actual redistribution, right? Getting the votes in the relevant parts of the country. But it is tremendously unwise because it is at best buying a few years of time with the problems that need solving here. So from a global justice standpoint, so a normative standpoint, what matters here? Well, first of all, important to see, and this is something we tend to forget given that now humanity is organized in a way that maximizes mutual indifference, right, in countries. It's important to keep in mind that actually the story of humanity is very much a story, a very interconnected story, right? So Homo sapiens, our ancestors, left Africa sometime 8,000 years ago, thereabouts, and then as they were leaving, as they were spreading around the globe, there has always been a often only very thinly connected human web. So these two guys here, the McNeil, father and son McNeil, historians, they wrote a wonderful book about that, the human web. So the human web is captive, this notion captures the interconnectedness that there has always been about ideas and also practices and often also goods traveling around. Right? You find bow and arrow everywhere from Western Europe to Japan, right? Before there was any kind of practical connectedness in terms of trade arrangements, right? Because these ideas traveled. In Australia, that didn't happen, right? So these people had kind of taken off before that happened, right? So it spreads very quickly. So over millennia, and also trade has been making the world, has been generating shared human development, and in recent centuries, this has been a kind of interconnectedness shaped by colonialism, imperialism. So what we got in those last centuries is something that sociologists sometimes call a world society, right? So a world populated by individuals, so the ontology of the world, much more about individuals than about countries, right? Where ideas are traveling around, are bouncing around, where economic structures are intensely interconnected. So intensely interconnected structure, for that reason, the idea of social justice that we're getting around 1800 is actually, when limited, if seen as limited to one country, is extremely unstable. Right? This makes sense to formulate social justice as limited to a domestic context from a 19th century standpoint, because from the point of view of any given person, the world really was small in this way back then. But given basic facts about interconnectedness these days, there is no stable notion of social justice at all. This is why we need to think bigger. I've made my own proposal about that in the book called Global Justice, where I'm distinguishing among several different grounds of justice. I will just kind of bring this to your attention now and not dwell on it, but the idea here really is that justice applies, different principles of distributive justice apply in different contexts. One of them is the state, but the world society as such is also one such context, the trade regime is one. So a more differentiated picture of global justice. And as an appeal to governments, this means that governments, and this is the exact opposite of what's being done in this country right now. So the idea there is that governments must actually take seriously obligations arising on all these different grounds rather than building walls and pretending there's no justice-based connection. My favorite means of doing this is inheritance tax. So I recently heard on German television, so Germans actually even more worried about inequality than Americans these days. I heard that 2/3 of people who were classified as wealthy, I don't know what the cutoff there was, but it doesn't matter for this purpose, 2/3 of those who were classified as wealthy had become wealthy through an inheritance or a gift, right? And so that's why inheritance tax, right? So the idea that people will have massive differences in life chances in the next generation, not because they accomplished something, but because they are genetically connected to somebody who did, that's an absurdity in a well-functioning economy. I think this is exactly the source of the ossification that we are getting a fair warning about from PDT's work. So, where does this all come out? Well, so inequalities across countries, to my mind, are not per se terribly worrisome. What is worrisome in the global context is the amount of poverty. Monique will talk more about that. So inequalities matter substantially because of this very thick context that we are sharing within countries. Poverty then is, because of the interconnectedness, is a bigger concern. There's thinner connectivity at the international level. But at the same time, what's also true is that we think about the global context, but I don't think global equality is a goal worth having or worth pursuing or can even plausibly be articulated. A lot of things need to be fixed in the global domain that, if fixed, will actually take care of a lot of differences all by themselves. So in particular, the trade system that we currently have is so massively rigged in favor of the wealthy countries that it's actually seriously embarrassing. So what we are finding then, this is what I want to leave you with, is so we do understand enough about socioeconomic policy these days that we can actually address these problems and that we can address domestic problems simultaneously with global problems. Right? The trade regime doesn't have to be rigged for us to take care of our of the working class that's losing out in this country. The wealthy are actually basically taking advantage of their position of power, persuading poor people that the solution to their misery is ignoring other obligations of justice that we also have to other people. So the wealthy are persuading everybody else that openness is not good for them, but the solution would be much more redistribution domestically, largely through inheritance taxes, and thereby through seriously smart policy choices. We can actually, we do know enough to deal with these problems all at the same time, but what in fact is happening is that the disadvantaged are constantly being played off against each other. That is the current global reality. Thank you.
Should differ from those to our fellow citizens, but if you think there are parts of the world to see their poverty. They view the local and global inequalities as hugely consequential to their poverty. And in fact, many see inequality at multiple levels as partly constitutive of their poverty, understood more broadly as deprivation and powerlessness. So global justice theorists, I think, can learn a lot about the dynamics between social inequalities and poverty from the organizations and social movements of poor communities, and we can really learn a lot from the more political view of poverty that's evolved from within development studies and poverty research. But first, let me say something about how that question has been answered, or what some of the effective responses to the Blake position have been. Some world cosmopolitans and mainly proponents of global distributed justice have argued that there do in fact exist structures and processes that connect people in different countries and that these are morally consequential. So we may lack shared institutions of global governance, but we have global economic and political processes that are coercive in the requisite ways. And these link our fates sufficiently so as to have implications in global distributed justice. And these are some of the harms from global inequality that these various thinkers have suggested in the fall that attach specifically to global inequalities as opposed to absolute poverty. Okay, so that's one set of responses. A couple others that are maybe a little less well known. A second takes Iris Noam's analysis of structural injustice and applies it to the global context. And here the idea is that national and transnational institutions, but also social norms and rules and social and economic policies, they all combine in ways that render particular social groups, that's also key here, social groups structurally vulnerable to poverty and starvation and exploitation. So, for example, women workers that work in ununionized garment factories in export processing zones in poor countries, it's not a coincidence that they're women. They're structurally vulnerable in ways that say the global distributed justice view is not able to see. So it tracks inequalities based on gender, race, ethnicity, caste, disability, and so on. A third tack is, I'm not going to say much about, but it applies relational egalitarian principles coming out of Anderson, and it applies that to the global realm. There are stats that some of the people here, Deveaux also does this. So here the idea is that whether the concern is whether people in different countries have equal standing and roughly equal opportunities and or threshold levels of capabilities, and that you can't. It matters whether people in different societies vis-a-vis one another have these, because otherwise you get things like exploitation, the export processing zones that I just mentioned. So these are not just considerations that are domestically relevant, they're relevant between societies as well. Gillian Rock, for example, argues that relational equality at a global level requires global policies and treaties not undermine some people's access to natural resources and other components like health. So these are so they go beyond this purely distributed. Okay, now these three responses show that matters of national and global distributed justice do that, and that because it uses care about many global inequalities. But I think we could and should go further than this and show why a commitment to alleviating poverty globally requires reducing inequalities at the global as well as other levels. Now, in development circles, this has become very mainstream, this idea. The SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, fully 11 of the 17 SDGs reference inequality or some adjacent concept like social exclusion. Goal number 10, I was trying to read that. Goal 10 calls for the reduction of inequality within and among countries. Okay, so this is pretty standard. This is not radical stuff here, so in that sense, I'm speaking more to philosophers because it's still very controversial today in philosophical debates to say that inequalities between people within societies matter. Now, this recognition by the SDGs that reducing global inequalities is critical to the goals of poverty reduction and development dovetails nicely with the more political and relational view of poverty that I've been trying to develop, which is coming out of development studies and poverty research. And just a note, I'm not talking about relative poverty, which takes conventional poverty measurements and applies them in a relative context. I'm talking about relational poverty in a different way. So let me explain what I mean by that. So what's called the relational approach to chronic poverty, this is chronic poverty defined as a capability failure across many dimensions that lasts at least 5 years. So the idea here is that you focus on the social power relations and structures that make possible or permit poverty and exploitation, rather than centering your definition of poverty on the conditions and characteristics of poverty. And one thing this does is that it brings out the dimensions of powerlessness and social exclusion that become so central to poverty analysis, but not in philosophy. It also connects with the shift towards a multidimensional poverty measurement and multidimensional measurements of well-being. The idea is that poverty-producing social relations and structures lead to a deprivation of basic needs, but what's important is that social inequality and social powerlessness are key, not just as causes of poverty, because you could run that argument, right? That they're not just causes, but they're partly constitutive of chronic poverty. And I think even on my capabilities approach, that's quite compatible with the capabilities approach too, because some of the capabilities that have to do with your ability to determine your own life, right? And your capacity for creation and all sorts of things that bear on social power questions. So, for example, a poor widow with children in sub-Saharan Africa, her poverty is shaped by proximate social relations like discriminatory poverty and inheritance regimes, and social norms that undercut some of her capabilities, like to do with work and her care responsibilities. But the effects of the economic globalization path that has been taken by global financial institutions are also very real. So it's led to, in her case, to think about the way that these institutions have neglected rural development and the creation of productive employment in former colonies. There's a legacy of IMF and World Bank structural adjustment programs that required, as a condition of their loans, the elimination of national food subsidies, privatization of natural resources like water, increases in the price of public services, reduction in wages, and goes on and on. So you can see how these things bear on this woman's poverty. It's not just a local description. So what are the implications of this? Where does it go? Well, in terms of solutions to, if you take a relational approach to poverty, instead of then seeing poverty in absolute terms and thinking about poverty mitigation as something that's kind of decontextualized, which you also tend to do too much of, you begin to think about how can we dismantle, reform, and transform structural social relations of inequality that create and sustain chronic poverty and powerlessness. That becomes the question. And this, as I found out, because this is what I've been working on the last few years, is the focus of many poor-led social movements in the global south. These are just a couple that I have been researching. MST, they're well known, Brazilian Independence Workers Movement, less well known, Slum Dwellers International, which is a global network of slum dwellers and pavement dweller groups in 32 countries, 478 cities. That's pretty impressive. They fight urban poverty by securing housing and municipal services like sanitation and water, which they conceive of as entitlements and social entitlements. They aim to make slum and pavement dwellers politically visible. They do enumerations, train slum dwellers to do enumerations, and they're fully led right up to the top ranks by slum and pavement dwellers. Enormously impressive. The Lannis rural workers movement in Brazil, MST, they have been around since 1984. They organize collective occupations of unused and private lands, and they turn these but they have a major impact on social policy too. They contribute to advocacy for social protection policies. Now their focus, the MST's focus, has always been the massive inequalities in land and wealth in Brazil, and exploitation and mistreatment of rural workers, and oppressive property relations. But both of them have followed a trajectory that I've noticed is quite common among force-centered social movements, which is that they start by taking in at local and national injustices like discrimination, exploitation and employment, inequalities in land and wealth, social exclusion, corruption is a big one. But before long, they start to connect these structures of inequality and subordination to the global political economy. And then you get this radical critique in their mission statements and their mandates and their pamphlets and so on. It's fascinating reading, where they're criticizing neoliberal economic policies, unjust trade, global inequalities, privatization of public resources, and political domination. Okay, so among philosophers who is beginning to look at poverty in this way, inequality in this way, well, I had a slide for this. There are three groups, I just want to mention them quickly. Development ethicists. Many development ethicists are beginning to go in this direction. Second are philosophers that emphasize structural justice. I mentioned some of them earlier. There's some that are applying this to an analysis of political domination. And then there's a third group that views global inequalities in terms of political domination. They use this kind of neo-Republican, small Republican language of non-domination freedom. But this group also includes those who have an analysis of racialized and gendered forms of social oppression that kind of scales it up to the global level. And I want to mention specifically Charles Mills's work in this regard, because I think that we all need to read it. In his work, essay called Race and Global Justice, he argues that global justice theorists have yet to fully acknowledge colonialism's legacy of racial domination and the implications that it's had for global inequalities. I think this is hugely important. He observes that global justice theory is reproducing mistakes of an earlier generation of philosophers who addressed domestic justice without talking about race at all, by leaving, Rawls famously, criticized for scarcely mentioning race in the theory of justice. And like Rawls, we're still writing 500-page books on global justice that omit all reference to race and racial oppression, as though the fact that the majority of the world's poor are brown or black is somehow a coincidence or not worth mentioning, or only contingently relevant in some sense. So I'm very worried that in 20 years, we're going to get criticized for saying, like, what about the elephant in your room? Why did you even look at that? So that's actually, it's a good quote from him. So just to wrap up then, I should say, in fairness, those who don't mention race will often talk about colonialism and slavery without an analysis of racial oppression as an ongoing process, not just at the domestic level, but at the global level. It's a conceptual point, not an empirical point, but it's a conceptual point that is an important one and can be readily supported with empirical analysis. So to wrap up, if you accept that we have duties of global poverty reduction, then in my view, this does commit you to reducing many kinds of global inequalities. It's not to say that it means that we need to aim at equality and that absurd kind of leveling down. Philosophers like to debate this about whether a commitment to equality would bring everybody down to the same level. That's not what reducing global inequality is about. It's about reducing these inequalities of social and political power that lead to, and all the sequelae that I've been mentioning, domination, subordination, exploitation. All right, so I think the last point I want to make is that inequalities of power. So I look forward to our discussion.
All right, I have two questions. One's a bit more Mathias focused and one's a bit more Monique focused. I'd love to hear from both of you on both of them, and then we'll open it up to you guys. So, first question is this. Given the massively global system that we live in, while you were talking, I sort of started inventorying the objects around me. So this is made in Mexico, and this is made in China, and this is made in China, and this is made in Japan. And I didn't take my clothes off, but I know that none of them are made here. I mean, obviously these trade relations like hugely define how we live our lives. It also looks, they're largely, hopefully, voluntary interactions with each other. Whereas being born someplace just happens to you, and citizenship is largely determined by that. Of course, there are people who voluntarily move across national borders, but usually we're just stick where we're born. Why should we think that the nation state makes sense anymore? Or like, what is the reason for thinking that we should so much of our life should be determined by the border around the United States of America rather than all of these other kinds of interactions that we engage in? Go.
Before I turn to that, let me quickly say one thing about what Monique said, since I've written a 500-page book on global justice without mentioning race, so I want to make a confession on that. I completely agree with what you said about the importance of investigating these phenomena of white ignorance, and I completely agree that Charles Mill's work there is an important impetus for philosophy as a field to do this. One observation as a kind of how an excuse as to why I came to that insight only after writing that 500-page book about mentioning race. I think this is a kind of a general phenomenon that a lot of white liberal types like myself thought that we had come quite a long ways in terms of race relations. Right? And we thought that until fairly recently, right? So when I went to grad school and then my first years on the job, this was kind of the mainstream view. Everybody thought, things are quite bad still, but we're on the right way. And it's really only in the last years that we are getting more and more confronted with these, these ideas that there's a new kind of racism. People are writing, very plausible books and saying there's racism without racists. So racism has found different outlets and different ways of manifesting itself. And that has hit me quite hard as an insight. So I'm actually kind of a repenting sinner on that. So I think this is actually just a hugely important thing that we want to grapple with. On your question about the nation state, Steve, one quick answer to this is, so I have my take on that is there is limitations to utopian thinking. So one can say a lot of things about nation states that are not working well. I try to articulate those by saying there's these different rounds of justice where a lot of activity in terms of distributive justice needs to happen that will have the effect of the state losing importance as an agent of justice. The state needs to see itself more as an agent of justice, also vis-a-vis these other rounds of justice. But what I think we simply cognitively can do in a serious way, when we don't have theorizing capacities for that, is to understand what a world without states would actually be like. So, I don't know what I'm striving for here because I can't theorize it properly. That's what the word state is, multiple power centers. And a strict cosmopolitan vision would do away with them, and I have no idea what the world, and they don't either, what a world like this would look like. That's why we get stuck with states and we should do the best we can with states. Do you want to add to that?
I'm fairly persuaded by capability theorists who say that the best way to protect people's capabilities and foster them is through state-based, just scale-wise, state-based kinds of services. So that has always seemed very compelling to me, and provisions, state provisions. But I do think that there's interesting work going on about multi-level democratic institutions, that we could really think about more concertedly about democratic governance on multiple levels and ways to implement that, because I think they need different kinds of justice needs, in essence.
Okay, so my second question is this. If we shift our focus away from absolute poverty to focus not only on absolute poverty, but also on these questions of inequality, especially social and political exclusion, it becomes a little harder to see what ordinary people can do about that. So like, we're familiar with the fact of altruism movement. People are dying, they need basic stuff. Let's get them mosquito nets and clean water. And those are very, very difficult problems, but they're tractable problems. You can put dollar amounts on them, you can do randomized control trials to figure out what works and what doesn't. Doesn't look like it's going to be anywhere close to that easy to address these kinds of inequalities, or even understand what are the first few steps for people who aren't already politicians to do. What do people like us do other than just throw money at the scheme?
Well, okay. There's kind of two questions in there, isn't there? I mean, it's true that it's easier to see acute poverty than it is to see certain kinds of social inequalities. Although those inequalities have been well dramatized at the domestic level, certainly, and we're all, there's a huge, obviously, national debate about those inequalities, and that really pulls at the kind of moral heartstrings of people. But in terms of motivating people to take steps, I think you can motivate people to care about exploitation, which is absolutely an effect of a deep social inequality, in the case that I mentioned with the export processing zones, the global inequality. So you can motivate people to care about things like exploitation, the return of sort of near slavery kinds of conditions in certain industries. But in terms of, was your question partly about with this core-centered or core-led social movement stuff? Well, there are ways to support core-led social movements that we haven't even begun to talk about in philosophy and political theory. There's many kinds of solidarity. There's a lot of solidarity work that can be done from a distance, included, to support those organizations. And there's a lot of legal changes, because these are often groups that are outlawed in their own countries initially, and they need a global outcry, they need global support. But it's true that it doesn't have the sort of instantaneous pull that the humanitarian iconography of starving children. It doesn't have that same pull. Like, it's hard to imagine what the iconography would be of political solidarity with a core-led social movement like the MST or the Sun Dwellers. We talked about this previously. I'm not opposed to the kind of philanthropic initiatives that the effective altruists and Peter Singer and so on are proposing, but I think of them as band-aid solutions, as a lot of people do for different reasons. And I want to push this other, more political dimension of poverty and push the kinds of solidarity responses that we could engage that we haven't really been on. So rather than thinking of ourselves in the global north as the only, as I call them, the only agents of justice, that we would begin to think about these pretty heroic people in poor communities running organizations of poor people, changing local laws and the solidarity and support and financial support, tactical support that they need we could start to think of them as agents of justice. So I think we need to first flip the question around. Instead of beginning with that question always, what can I do? Because, you know, we are affluent, and this problem must be something that we lead on. To ask, well, what are the forms of support that these social movements are asking for? That's one take on it.
So I think individuals and also social movement and they're hugely important in international politics. It's no doubt about that. But I think we have also learned, especially after the financial meltdown in 2008, how important the states still are. So states have a mobilizing capacity, financial strength, capacities of the sort that can be pushed through these other agents, but really only states can actually dispense them. So states are hugely important. So we're asking, what is it that we more concretely need to do? We have to make sure that the person currently occupying the White House becomes a one-termer. That's you guys in Ohio. I want to say actually much better position. I kind of envy you that in Massachusetts. You know, there's going to be no action at all. You guys can do this, so we definitely there. The damage being done, not just to this country, but to the planet in these weeks is limited only by the dysfunctional nature of the Republican Party. And that's where we need change. And then at the global level, what needs to be done and what can be done if we have a more competent person in the White House again, is we need to redo the trade system and we need to redo the global finance system. The amount of tax evasion that goes on at the global level, the amount of tax pushing, that companies are paying taxes where they're not based, all of that stuff, that inclusive needs to end, and but that requires strong state leadership, and what's happening in the world right now under this president is going exactly the wrong way.
Questions?
Thanks a lot to all. I have a question, the first for Monique, but I'd be very interested in Mathias to say about it too. So I found the relational approach you proposed really plausible initially, but I wanted to ask just a little bit about operationalizing some of the concepts you mentioned. So exploitation, for instance. So just to try to be concrete, so funds get made in China, but for people here, and people here benefit, and people in China also benefit, but I find it very hard to know, like, proportionally, how much would they have to benefit relative to people here for it to not be exploited. So clearly, the mere fact that they're both benefiting isn't enough, but beyond that, it's sort of hard to know how do you start answering that question.
Yeah, well, what I would say is that we would need to take the question into a broader frame than just unfair benefit, the sort of one-timer kind of, it's been reduced to that kind of liberal model of, has somebody gained unfairly? That we would need to think about structural vulnerability and structural coercion, limited options, which are not normally seen as part of that liberal view of exploitation. Constrained options don't tell for or against exploitation, but I would say actually constrained options do. Now there's the danger that you could kind of gut the concept of exploitation such that every third person in the world is exploited. So that's a danger, you need to think about that. But I would broaden the range of factors that we would consider far beyond unfair remuneration. Thanks.
Thank you very much both for your presentations. My question was about, I guess maybe Mathias spoke about it already, for the sociology of why philosophers have become so focused on issues of distributed justice, and less on issues of social and political power. And it seems like, Monique, what you're suggesting is that if we see social or inequalities in social and political power, even at the global level, that they're tied up with distributive inequalities. Maybe not you said maybe not just as a source, but also as a kind of constitutive sense of poverty, of being impoverished insofar as you are, socially and politically excluded. And sort of what accounts for, what do you think accounts for the failure of philosophers to recognize that until recently, at least in the kind of Western global justice literature?
Well, it's so much easier just to have our contained little debates about duties and to have fewer moving parts to the conversation, to keep poverty as a kind of fixed known quantity. In fact, if you look at 20 years ago, it was always spoken about in terms of hunger. So it wasn't even a thing called poverty in many cases. They just say, okay, I'm just going to assume hunger is a fact, and so it simplifies it. And then you can go on to talk, if you're a moral philosopher, about the different calibrated moral duties and so on. So I think, and I think that with the exception of development ethicists, obviously, and that's why I'm standing so on, that many mainstream moral and political philosophers who are writing about poverty are still not reading, they haven't kept up with the evolution of poverty and inequality. And if you were having more of a conversation with each other about those things. And I also blame distributive justice thinking, which, it's interesting. Mathias, I think, has rightly noted that that's become much too funneled. It's not as broad anymore as perhaps it used to be. But I blame the distributive justice paradigm, which is quite hegemonic in studies of global justice theory, because power is just kind of written out of so many of those discussions, and it becomes about holdings and resources. So if we were reading more poverty research, which is all about social exclusion, right? Not all about, but that's huge in that literature now. And looking at, there are some philosophers, there's a group in Austria that's philosophers that are looking at the non-material harms of poverty, misrecognition, disrespect, humiliation, those kinds of things. But that's all fairly recent, it's true.
So on this issue, I guess whether philosophers are negligent of these things is a bit of a question I'm continuing out with. So after I made my confession earlier on the race issue, I want to now go the other way on this issue. I think this is a negligence that the best people working on distributive justice are simply not guilty of. From Aristotle on, there has always been an understanding of distributive justice that was much richer than just kind of material status. That's why I pointed out the honors were included. If you read Rawls, so why is Rawls historically so important? Rawls writes looking back at 200 years of debate about things that one can classify as distributive concerns. Right? So there's a multidimensional theory. It's often been criticized for being too multidimensional, there's too much going on, but for example, liberties and powers are explicitly mentioned as primary goods, right? So not everybody is like there. But I think people these days articulating distributive concerns, the best work done on that front is work that articulates how societal structures function and how they are arranging ways in which people have shares of what we do together. So I think there might be some people who are guilty of that, but the amount of criticism that the distributive paradigm gets leaves me sometimes wondering, who are they talking about? I don't know who these people they're talking about.
Just want to reiterate thank you both for being here and speaking today. You both spoke about, we're recording. You both spoke about the disparate impact that poverty has on race, and you mentioned colonial legacy. I wondered if you guys would be willing to expand on what impact you think colonial legacy has had on the current situation today.
Do you mean on the current situation vis-a-vis global inequality or global poverty?
Global poverty.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very big, there's a very big story there about, how the, legacy of colonial domination and then processes of decolonization, I wish there were a political economist that, I'm sure there's development economists in the room who could explain this better, but, left former colonies in conditions where they couldn't build certain kinds of national political institutions, and then came a very uneven process of development that left many countries completely, again, without the domestic institutions to catch up, left them unable to increase the national incomes of their people and provide basic services and infrastructure. I mean, the position we're in now is not the battle days of the IMF and World Bank structural adjustment programs, which were devastating in their effects. The loan conditionality requiring neoliberal kinds of policies, but maybe Mathias, I think, has a different view of this, so we can
it's a tough subject. You can think of that on different levels, right? So if you're asking kind of a macro historical question, and you're asking anything that kind of at some point verges on the question, what would have happened with these countries, in these countries, to these regions, if colonialism had never hit them, right? So once you come to a question like that, I think what one has to do is suspend judgment. I mean, we really have no idea, what would have happened and what that trajectory would have been. There is a reason why those who became colonizers did become colonizers, right? It's not that they were only the stronger countries because they colonized, right? The mechanisms are very complicated there. So big counterfactual questions I think don't really have answers here. What I think is easier to answer is if you think about the transition from the colonized world that we had, say at the end of the Second World War, into a world consisting now of 190 plus sovereign states. Right? So if you look at what's happening in this period, the last 70 years, for example, in trade arrangements, right? How have developing country economies been integrated? Then you can actually say that is a massive exercise of exclusionary power, right? Where you could see at the end of the Second World War repeatedly the increasing number of developing countries made efforts to get more recognition in different ways in the global trading system, and they were consistently hit in the face for that. So basically, the transatlantic region made their deals with each other. Japan was eventually integrated. Henry Kissinger said explicitly the axis of power starts in Moscow, goes through Berlin, and goes through America and in Tokyo, where nobody else matters. And we still see that in the World Trade Organization today, which is a trade arrangement that was forced upon the developing countries, to increase the reach of developed countries' service industries and to prevent knowledge transfer through reverse engineering in the developing world. That was a massive blow to these countries, and that you can be as skeptical as I was before about the bigger picture of colonialism. That was a massive blow against them, and in my mind, a massive injustice. The Doha round, the current developing round, has been going on for 15 years. And the Doha round only exists because developed countries were promised an actual development round in the trade system, and the reason why this is still going on is because the rich countries are simply not willing to give them anything that they care about. And that is that at the global level, that is the case.
And back. Okay. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed those presentations. It's on. Okay, great. So I just wanted to ask you both to talk a little bit more about the relationship between sort of state, domestic, and international factors and explaining global poverty and inequality, because it seems to me at one point in Monique's presentation it sounded like the international institutions were quite important and consequential. But then I think about historically a country like China, which basically was able to lift 300 million people out of poverty within 25 years without huge transformations of the international structure, but mainly because it went from Mao's policies to a more rational, pragmatic economic policy after Deng Xiaoping was made the leader. So I just wonder about that. And in that case, it's very much a domestic determinant, I think, of basically problems of poverty within China. And then Mathias, my question for you is, at one point you say that the state is what we've got, and so I want to press you a little bit more on that. One problem I think that we see in the developing world is that about 75% of people don't actually operate within the formal economy. And that means that no matter how much you build up the state, they don't have access to state mechanisms of justice with respect to economic relations. So there, I'm not really sure that building up the state more and the international community helping to build up legal rational instruments is going to help 75% of the people who are actually still trying to make it, in the informal economy. And then but the other ambitious question, I guess, is about world state formation. So if it is the case that the sources of global inequality are ultimately global capitalism, do we not need a world state that would be strong enough to resist a global source of domination?
Thanks, Catherine. I wasn't trying to say that the inequalities at the global level that we ought to be concerned about are in any way like a mirror image of the one at the domestic level. The example of the widow in sub-Saharan Africa, I think, kind of shows that nicely, that there are different kinds of social relations and inequality that are relevant that are kind of proximate to her, that are very different from the kinds that we have reason to be concerned about at the global level. But they intersect, and they have a kind of compounding effect as well. One thing that those inequalities one thing that state level inequalities do is make it difficult for the LDCs, the least developed countries, to develop social welfare states, right? They can't offer social protections, basic welfare protections to their citizens for all of the kinds of, some of the reasons that Mathias is talking about, the kinds of gross inequalities in trade, negotiating power, and essentially exclusion from or second or third class system within the global state system at the UN level and so on. So I think that there's a synergy between those global state level inequalities and the domestic social inequalities, and it's kind of a checkerboard. I'm trying to resist just scaling up those social inequalities to the global level because I can see that they're not the same kind of inequalities. They become more, they're geopolitical and economic, but at the global level. But as we know, those kinds of global inequalities can reinforce and compound local social inequalities, just like the legacy of colonialism put in many of these discriminatory inheritance laws that right women out of inheriting property, for example, specifically in sub-Saharan Africa. So those kinds of global policies can absolutely compound the domestic inequalities.
So on the global stage, Catherine, I know you like the global stage. And look, it's not that I deny that you can formulate some desiderata on the global stage. Right? There are certain things, just like I can formulate certain desiderata about why it's good to have a multiplicity of these things, right, states. My point there really is, it's one thing to formulate desiderata, so you're kind of writing down characteristics of what the structure should be. My concern about this is, really theorizing what the world would be like, where power centers really have been dismantled, where there really is no power, at the root level coming out of Washington, Moscow, Beijing, those places, right? So given what evolutionary psychology keeps teaching us about what kind of tribal creatures we are, that just makes it harder for me to even have anything like a working understanding of what the world without the world that we have now is the one world that history has taught us about. That's the one world we have built, right? And this is too much of a stretch for theory to do anything with the world state. It's an interesting move that you say, well, maybe not a world state, so in a way you could kind of conceive of it as said, and what about all these places in the world where there really are no functioning states in the first place? So that's a good move. So yes, of course, what we do have, the state is an organizational model that ultimately was exported around the world through colonialism, and that then in decolonization, these structures, it's kind of interesting how exactly one would formulate that, right? It's not that they were compelled to adopt such structures, right? So if you think about the anti-colonial struggle in South America, right? I mean, they could have done something else. They decided to be states, they decided to be countries. And then later, in a way, the more countries became independent, the more countries were added, the more they simply had to understand that the way to do business in the world was to become a state, right? So what do you say to that? I mean, do you want to say to them, look, you guys in Africa, why don't you kind of disintegrate and see what happens next? I mean, this is in a way, it is an unfortunate fact about the development of history for them, in particular in Africa, that they ended up with a political model that wasn't of their own engineering. That is an unfortunate fact. I think the way forward from here on is not to say to them, why don't you kind of undo state structures for 100 years and then we kind of come visit again and see what's happening with me. Given where we are, regardless of how we got here, I think at this stage the question is how do we strengthen them? How do we let them do experiments? We only have this one planet to work with and this one history.
Hi, I really enjoyed it and lots of both of these talks. Thank you. I have a question for each of you, and I think they're related. A question for Mathias, I'll go in a second, which I hope will bring the two of you into dialogue there and help me understand what the state of the relation between your views is at the moment. First, for Monique, in philosophy recently we've had a series of talks about various kinds of conceptual engineering, which are trying to change the ways that certain concepts are understood on ethical or pragmatic grounds rather than on sort of traditional analytical grounds. When you said that poverty is partly constituted by diminutions in power, and that you wanted this not to be merely a sort of causal relationship between material poverty and power poverty. That sounds weird to me, and I tend to think, why not separate things when one can? I wasn't sure whether you saw what you were doing as coming under some more general concept of poverty that motivates why we should think of both of these things as parts of poverty, or whether it was really a matter of sort of noticing that a lot of people are prepared to say we should care about poverty in global justice, so then you want us to care about more things, so you've got reasons to attach power relations to poverty that are pragmatic and moral. That was the question for you. My question for Mathias is, in the talk, you said something to the effect of, I'm not going to worry about global inequality, I'm going to worry about poverty. In response to another question here, you said, look, people who care about distributive justice, we haven't only cared about material poverty, we've cared about a bunch of different primary goods, which include things like power security. I wondered whether you end up siding with those who want to have questions about global justice handled. Sorry, I'm feeding back here. Whether you want to have questions about global justice addressed more to questions about material poverty, let the states handle power, if you will, or whether you were thinking that when you were thinking of poverty as a domain of global justice, you meant to be including the sorts of things that Monique was urging ought to be included in poverty.
Yeah, I'm really taking my lead from, in kind of stretching poverty out, and I'm taking my lead from this shift in poverty research, where it's become quite commonplace to include social exclusion and marginalization and powerlessness in the very definition of poverty. Now, it is still a live debate, it's true. Some people say we need to return to an earlier notion of poverty that really does focus on material scarcity, so it's still a debate. But European poverty research long ago moved to the social exclusion model. I mean, they define poverty in relative terms. It means, you know, if you have less than 60% of the average national income, then you're poor, and it's because of the social exclusion. You can't go to a movie, you can't go to, you know, all these things that you're excluded from society. So that is, I call it powerlessness, they call it social exclusion, social marginalization. So I'm kind of taking my lead there, which isn't to say that it's the right thing. I didn't invent it, is all I'm saying. And then there's a lot of recent, then the social exclusion model moved to development research maybe 15 years ago. Deep in Narayan, three-part volume commissioned by the World Bank, of all sources, Voices of the Poor, where they interviewed, I think it was 5,000 poor people about what's their, in the LDCs, what's your experience of poverty, what's the worst thing about poverty, and they were stunned to find that rather than material scarcity alone, one of the most common things across many societies, and this was a multi-country study, was that the powerlessness that they felt, the randomness, the arbitrary power that their landlord, their employer, their, you name it, the corruption of the local officials, it was the indeterminacy and the arbitrariness of that power over their lives, and their feeling that they could not predict and shape their own lives day to day. So that social exclusion, marginalization, and powerlessness comes up again and again in those. So I think there is good reason to include that in our definition of poverty, even if we might want to take a pluralist approach and say, well, we still need some notion of poverty that really does just get at the material poverty, the material scarcity. But I think the broader view is going to help us get at a lot of these other kinds of issues, and that's why I think that poverty is equal parts deprivation and powerlessness. I think the capabilities approach actually does also support that kind of a view, that if you look at what are the core capabilities, they absolutely, some of them absolutely do track social powerlessness.
So the theory that I'm proposing, the overall picture that I'm proposing, is this grounds of justice view, right? That we have these different contexts where respectively different principles of justice apply. Now, these are then also contexts in which the thing, what philosophers call the distribuendo, right? Whose distribution, whose relative allocation, or whose allocation in the first place we are concerned with, that's different across these contexts. Right? So if we are thinking about a state, a country, what we care about there, so I think we're all set to take on that. These social primary goods, right, which ultimately are the things, including powers and liberties, that are coming out of the intensely cooperative and coercively enforced context that, the state, at least the kind of ideal type state in the contemporary world is. Right? And so that's what we're caring about in that context. And what is being produced in that context, what we're doing together in that context, is quite a lot because of the intense intensely cooperative nature of that thing. Right? And it's because of that, then, that also the kind of claims that we have against each other definitely extend to the relative allocation of material goods, which are a subset of what we produce together. Right? So, but within this context, that matters because it also has an impact on the other things. Right? So, Jacob mentioned work of Larry Bartels. Right? Larry Bartels has shown I've done a lot of work about how voting behavior in Congress is reflecting class membership, about how poor people are getting consistently duped, about their own interests and let themselves be duped. We see this in action, right? And this is why money in politics matters, and this is why relative ownership of money and wealth in these societies matters, right? Among other things. So then we're moving, say, in broad society context to adopt that term from sociology. We are caring about other things there, I think. What makes that the ground of justice is the kind of interconnectedness that we have in the human web, in the world society that it is today. That is interconnectedness strong enough to become eligible for consideration of justice, not of the same sort as it is in the nations, in the country, like where the relative standing matters. So what we care about internationally, I think, can be fleshed out in terms of human rights. But these human rights in turn also, and this is why I'm kind of resisting the point about how philosophers have been negligent here. The World Bank has, the IMF has, they have been pushing this picture that human change is about change in GDP. It's not a philosophical position, this is an international organization position that Mathias has done a lot to challenge. But in philosophy, philosophy is a latecomer to these debates anyway, right? And the early people like Weitz and Henry Shue in the early 80s already knew and articulated very strongly that human rights have to do with both subsistence and security. Right? So security as the protection of personhood, my status as a political agent. So we do care about that at the international level also, but we care about that at the more, in a more confined sense of human rights. It is not my concern as an American citizen what the relative distribution of goods in Mexico or Argentina is, but that they have human rights, including both subsistence and security. That is my concern as an American citizen. Would you disagree with that?
No, we actually didn't talk enough about rights. I would not disagree with that.
Let's formally call it quits, but we have a reception for the next hour, so hang around and talk to all of our panelists. Come back tomorrow at 8:45. There will be coffee and light refreshments and brilliant discussions.